Hello everybody, my name is Darian and welcome back to the pits. On today's agenda is my review for Diablo IV as it existed in its beta stage. There are two things to note before going into this further, however, and firstly is that I focused on and solely played the Druid class for this beta, so my views are going to be purely from that standpoint. Secondly, I only played in the open beta over this past weekend, not the early access beta, so all footage is pulled from there. Now then, let's get into what we all came here for. To begin with, I'm going to discuss what my thoughts on the graphics and performance side of things was. Keeping in mind this beta was a stress test beta, so it's not going to exactly equate to what the experience will be at full release. Graphically speaking, the game is absolutely astounding while managing to maintain a nice level of minimalism simultaneously. Each environment had a wonderful atmosphere, amazing attention to detail, a reasonable amount of destroyable objects, and plenty of things with the characters plenty of things on the characters themselves to keep people intrigued and invested. Additionally, the features implemented to help keep track of certain things on screen amongst the potential visual noise have actually helped me immensely during my time playing, and I don't think I'll be ever turning them off in the full release. Now, for the negatives of the graphical side of things, in terms of the enemies, some attacks don't quite have clear enough visuals to tell that they're going to happen or are happening, with exceptions to the bosses. And additionally, a large part of the interactable environment pieces are things that are easily a struggle to actually notice, as they blend in too easily with the environments, from what I have personally seen. As for performance, I genuinely didn't struggle at all, even having a weaker PC than most, other than zone transitions and the time spent in town due to the amount of people there leading to some rubber banding. I didn't have any issues. Things ran smoothly overall, even with a large amount of particles on screen, and for a Diablo game, that's extraordinarily good, since the franchise isn't exactly known for being a system's best friend. Next, let's talk a bit about the voice work and the general sound design of the game overall. I really enjoyed the voice acting of every character in this game more than I thought I would, since previous entries in the franchise have always kind of left me feeling like the characters were more cheese than people with their voice lines and the delivery of them, with notable exception to specifically Diablo III's Deckard Cain. That man can read me a bedtime story any day of the week. This time around, though, the characters actually speak in a reasonably realistic way for how you'd think they'd react to the situations unfolding around them, and the delivery of those lines was superb on every bit of it that I had come across. Additionally, of note, there were severely less voice lines for the player's character while in combat thus far, and honestly, I was really happy about that because of how heavily Blizzard overdid the combat voice lines back in Diablo 3. Moving on to sound design in general, there wasn't really a lot to say here, to be honest. Almost disappointingly little, actually. Outside of some cutscenes or seemingly important plot moments outside of them having nice music to go along with it, the sound design for the most part seemed kind of average, as they used a good amount of reused sounds from let me clarify. It seemed like they used a lot of reused sounds from Diablo 3 or stock sound effects. Now, tossing the soundtrack in with this point of sound design is honestly more of the same. There was a music for boss fights and honestly just overall that I felt was rather jarring in a majority of circumstances. It didn't feel like there was enough music there. moving swiftly along the skills, I'm going to keep this very short and sweet and leave it rather simply at this. There feels like there's enough going on with the skill tree system in the game now that it keeps a feeling of being interesting, but it does so without trying to turn into Path of Exile, which is the closest example I can really relate to the skill system, where there's too much going on and no real effective way to keep track of it. I was genuinely impressed with how little there was on the skill tree while still feeling like it was entirely possible to make it feel like you're capable of making unique builds for your characters, which was honestly a pretty big weak point in my opinion back in the previous titles. The next thing I'm going to talk about is arguably the most important part, and that's the combat. The current system of combat in the game feels overall extremely good. It feels like your character's attacks are actually impactful and have some meat behind them. The enemy AI actually seems pretty good overall so far. And the feeling of visual enjoyment in the combat was extraordinarily high for a game that seems to not have a lot visually going on for your character side of things, at least yet. When it comes to combat, there's only really two things I had an issue with, and one of those is more of a personal gripe than a legitimate game impacting issue in my opinion. And to first talk about that gripe, it is the nightmarish / terrifying prefix that some enemies can get. It's just simply not enjoyable in my opinion at all. Unlike most crowd control effects, Terrify stops you from acting on your own terms as well as making you actively flee from enemies. Which in a game where you need to be able to directly click on your enemies from and where tight environments with a lot of obstructions are common, that's an extremely heavy interruption on gameplay that feels like way too long of a time period to go through. That point is, once again, the one I found to be more of a personal gripe, not the one that I think is actually negatively game impacting. Now, on to the issue that I actually see being a negative impact on the game, and that's boss behavior. Certain bosses have attacks that grant them temporary invulnerability, or alternatively have player-specific traps in the central parts of their stages that do really heavy damage, and man oh man do they love to abuse those. It seemed every boss I ran into that had some kind of immunity granting attack loved to use that particular attack in large strings of itself or as every other attack. And the bosses with player traps in their arenas seem to just love hiding either in or next to them, which kind of just sucks having to try to fight them in the middle of a pool of death. I hope Blizzard before full release goes through and fixes that, but for now that's a pretty big downside in my opinion to the combat. Only other thing I can maybe think about for complaints here is that you have attack and movement bound to the same place by default again. But unlike Diablo 3, that's actually fixable via settings this time, so I'm not really too upsetty about that. Before I get to what I'm going to say, honestly, are the two largest points being the overall gameplay and the feeling of exploration. For this game, I'm going to go ahead with my thoughts on the story. I'm refraining from forming an opinion at present about it. Sure, everything seems fine for now, but this beta also only let us cover Act 1 of the game. And I don't want to try to form an opinion while having substantial chunks of information about the thing I'm forming one on just missing. So, until the full game releases, I'm not going to be forming an opinion on the story. Now on to the aforementioned largest points, the gameplay and exploration. It seemed for all intents and purposes that Blizzard was designing Diablo IV to be some form of MMORPG. And honestly, it felt really nice overall. There were no systems that weren't explained well by the game, and everything seemed to be graspable incredibly easily, and they all meshed together really well. I am not a big fan of MMOs in most instances because they commonly just have too many systems in place for my brain to wrap around that don't exactly get explained very nicely. But in Diablo IV, that seemed to be the exact opposite of the case. As for exploration, I found myself exploring at random a lot and being sucked into the world more than I thought I would, thanks to all the random events, extra dungeons, and cellars to clear, as well as the general world collectibles and materials to go farming for. The exploration formed itself really nicely and honestly was only brought on pretty naturally, without much force from the game. The only thing that really brought it down was the fact that the map honestly was just filling itself in whenever you found a new zone, which kind of killed my sense of, wonder and exploration a little bit. And the traversal animations, like climbing the walls, sliding down hills, crawling through crawl spaces, they were all just a bit too slow for my tastes, as well as some of them were seemingly only one way. When the full game releases, I'm looking forward to exploring every inch of the world in full myself, which for me personally, that's kind of rare. I don't do that a lot. To bring my thoughts full circle to a brief summary, here is the TLDR for this video, for those of you that I know are inevitably going to skip here and want to just watch this. Combat is incredible with exceptions to some bosses. Exploration feels very natural and fun to partake in. The skill system in the game is a perfect example of complexity while still being fairly simple. The voice work in the game is absolutely top tier for no explainable reason for what type of game it is. Visually, the game is absolutely great in my opinion. Performance-wise, this seems to be easily the most stable entry to this franchise, at least for myself thus far, and that's a huge W for the game. And the MMO elements actually add to this game instead of just taking away from it and making it a bit of a slog. This, so far, is the TLDR for Diablo IV as it exists right now from myself. Obviously, this was a review for the beta, so things are prone to change between now and June 6th when the game formally releases on the Blizzard store. That said, this is the end of the video, and if you've made it this far, I thank you for sticking it through to this point. If you enjoyed, then a like on the video would be incredibly appreciated, and you can always subscribe to catch future uploads here on the channel. With all that out of the way, I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye.